This is episode 109 of the Magic Detective Podcast. On this episode, you'll hear about the early life of David Bamberg, Fu-Manchu. That and more on this episode of the Magic Detective Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Magic Detective Podcast, your podcast home for magic history. I'm your host, Dean Carnegie. I am the Magic Detective, and this is episode 109. It seems like we've had a flurry of magic history auctions and conferences of late, and I have sadly missed them all. I saw some photos of the Bill Smith David Sandy conference, and it looked incredible. So many lucky attendees got to go to David Copperfield's museum. There was a recent Potter and Potter auction where one of Houdini's trunks went for huge money. Forget his tricks. This was just a trunk and not a trick trunk either. Say that 10 times fast. Congratulations, whoever won the trunk and got that for their collection. That's a prized piece. Let's see, what have I been doing? I've been selling some of my artwork over the past few months, and these have all been original pieces. I was planning on stopping the sale of the original works soon, and then only selling like high-end prints. And I still plan to do that, but I'm not exactly sure when. I was going to do it like as I'm speaking, like right now, this was going to be the cutoff, but I'm a little behind in things, so I may still release some of the originals. In fact, I have an original painting of Fu-Manchu that I will be offering up. It's acrylic on stretched canvas. It's painted in kind of an abstract caricature fashion. I believe it's a 20 by 24 in size, if memory serves. Anyway, I'll post the image over on the Magic Detective Facebook group page and also on my blog. And if you're interested, just reach out and let me know that you would like to purchase it. By the way, before I forget, FISM is in Italy this year, and they're doing something new. There is an online category, and among the topics is Best Magic Podcast. Now, I am not nominated. However, there is a write-in box. So, for all of my listeners, if you're so inclined and would like to vote for me, I'm not likely to win, but it may help me to get on the ballot for the next FISM. So, if you're interested in that, to vote for me for the Best Magic Podcast for FISM, this is the address. It's www.fismitaly2025.com/online-special-awards. And just so you know, I'll put that link in the Magic Detective notes, so you can find the link there as well. Okay, so great. You know, like I said, they're doubtful I would win this year, but who knows? Maybe next time around. So before I get into the life of Fu-Manchu, I should talk about my first exposure to the man. I had read about the famous Bamberg dynasty of magicians and that he was the last in the line of the dynasty. And I'd seen some photos in various magic books. But then my first time visiting Beverly, Massachusetts to see Le Grand David in his own spectacular magic show, that's when things really changed. Because at some point during the show, Marco the Magi, who we all know as Cesario Pelaez, came out and began to share some details about Fu-Manchu and how, as a child, he saw Fu-Manchu in his native Cuba. And I was spellbound by the story. Then I think it was the following summer while on vacation, family vacation, my dad made a surprise stop at the American Museum of Magic in Marshall, Michigan. And Bob Lund welcomed us in. And somewhere on that tour, he mentioned a manuscript he had on the life of David Bamberg, but he kind of doubted that it would ever get published. Well, lo and behold, a number of years later, that book was published, and it was called Illusion Show, The Life Story of David Bamberg, a.k.a. Fu-Manchu. And it was and is still one of the greatest biographies of a magician I've ever read. Now, back to Cesario. Years later, we became really good friends, and he shared with me many stories about Fu-Manchu. And through his influence, it's almost like I met the man. I met Fu-Manchu. I didn't, but just from hearing all the stories, I felt like I did. So you can imagine my excitement to finally delve into the life story. Now, here's one other thing I should add. I was so excited about doing this. As I worked on it, I realized, oh dear, I'm not going to be able to put this in one podcast because it would be 3 hours long. So today we're just doing the early life of Fu-Manchu. So, my friends, let's explore the early life of David Bamberg, aka Fu-Manchu. David Tobias Bamberg was born February 19th, 1904 in Derby, England. He was the son of Lillian and Tobias Bamberg, who was known as Theodore and professionally known as Okido. Now, when your dad is a magician and all his friends are magicians, it's hard to pinpoint when David actually got interested in magic himself, or maybe it was just a natural progression from one family member to another. After all, the first Bamberg was Jasper, who was born nearly 100 years before the Declaration of Independence was even written. And Jasper passed on his love of magic to his son, and then that onto his son, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, David is the seventh generation of magical Bambergs. Many people claim it as the sixth. Usually those that say it's the sixth exclude Jasper in the list, but reading the Illusion Show biography, Robert, who is David's son, mentions that he would have been the eighth generation. So I'm going to go with David Bamberg being the seventh generation. Now we know, thanks to the wonderful book, The Oriental Magic of the Bambergs by Eric Lewis, and also Illusion Show by David Bamberg himself, that he was drafted into the Okido show by his parents at the age of 4. It was their custom to leave him alone in the hotel while they were performing at night. But one particular evening, a fire arose at the hotel, and David barely made it out alive. So from that point on, little David Bamberg would be part of the Okido show. And David's job in the show was to make a magical appearance. But like with a lot of magic, despite the fact Okido got all the credit, David did most of the work. So I guess that might count as David's first trick. His first presentation of magic on his own happened at the Parent Assembly in New York during a ladies' night event on October 9th, 1909. He did a card trick, but the one that really stood out and is mentioned in numerous books was a trick he did in the back of the room at Martinka's Magic Shop. He used a piece of his father's apparatus built by Okido himself. It was a production box, but no mention of what he produced from there. What is always mentioned was his assistant. David asked for a volunteer to assist him, and out from the crowd came none other than Harry Houdini. The audience must have been a who's who of magical celebrities. David Bamberg definitely had a charmed life. In June 1915, David would make what was called his professional debut at the Flatbush Christian Church. He presented 30 minutes of magic all by himself, and according to David Price's book, The Pictorial History of Magic in the Theater, it ended with a veritable ovation. Young David was 11 years old at this time. His father, Okido, who I will reference occasionally, but in the future, Okido will have his own episode. Okido worked for Thurston, but not as Okido, which was his stage name, of course. He performed his shadowgraphy act as Theo Bamberg, his real name, and also was a stage mechanic for Thurston, helping to keep the show running. David was said to assist his father at times, and there are references to David helping Thurston on stage, and you might wonder how an 11 or 12-year-old boy might help Thurston the Great. Well, Thurston did a trick called the eggs from the hat. This was a creation of David Devant, and with his blessing, Thurston made it part of his show. It's a really charming effect for the time. A boy and a girl were selected from the audience, and the boy was often David. Thurston would show everyone an empty hat and then produce an egg after egg after egg. These he would hand to the girl, and then the girl would hand them to the boy. And it wasn't long before the boy's arms were overloaded with eggs, and despite his best efforts, they would start falling vicariously to the stage floor and splatter. And the audience would laugh more and more at the boy's calamity. Now, perhaps today such an effect maybe might not go over as well or might need some fine-tuning. But in Thurston's hands, it was real magic. David Bamberg looked up to Thurston with great admiration. He would go on to say that Thurston taught him the importance of having a strong stage presence, and Thurston even taught David how to do the classic card pass. Now, from the pages of Illusion Show, David mentions that one day he decided to show Houdini a card trick at his home. In the course of presenting it, he mentioned that Thurston was his teacher. Well, this was a poke to Houdini's ego, apparently, because at that point, he took the deck of cards and he said to David, "Let me show you a card trick." And with that, he went into his own card artistry act. This included different kind of juggling feats with cards where he'd spread the cards up his arm, have them turn over and catch them in one hand. He'd spring the cards from hand to hand. He did multiple cuts in his hand. Remember, Houdini began as the king of cards. And in France, where French audiences were unfamiliar with handcuffs, he resorted to his card act, which made him famous in Paris. Now, there's a wonderful story from the book Illusion Show where David mentions seeing Houdini present his needle trick, and he had no idea how it was done, not even a guess. And he mentioned it to his father, and his father berated him for wanting to know how such a vulgar trick was done. And he told him never think about it again. Fast forward now a little bit when Okido gives his son a piece of equipment to take over to Houdini's house. David takes it over, and Houdini's in the house by himself, and they chat for a while. And then Houdini offers David some chewing gum, and he didn't have it on his pockets, and he thought he did. So he tells David to go over to the dresser drawers. There should be a packet of gum in the top shelf, and sure enough, or the top drawer. So he goes over, and that's when David opened the drawer to get the gum. He spotted something that no human being should have been allowed to see: the secret to the needle trick. It only took him a moment, and it made complete sense. And he took his gum and he shot out the door, partly from his embarrassment of finding this sacred thing by accident. And he didn't want Houdini to know of his discovery, so he bolted. Now, when he was 13, he and a friend went to see the Zanzig Act. This would have been Julius and Agnes Zanzig. However, Agnes had recently died, and Julius replaced her with a young man he called Henry, but the man's real name was Paul Rosini. When the show was over, Zanzig talked to young David Bamberg. He had known him when he was an even younger boy, and the two began to chat, and Julius told David that he was going to have to close the show soon because Henry had recently been drafted, and with Agnes having passed away, he had no one to do the act with. In truth, he was actually remarried to a woman named Ada, but she was dreadful with the act at that time, so Julius decided to offer the job to David. Now, young David immediately said yes, but he knew he had to check with his mother and father, and they were against it. By the way, Houdini had visited the night they were discussing it, and they asked Houdini his opinion. Houdini felt the boy really needed his education first, so things looked kind of bleak. But the next morning, Julius came by and added to the proposition of having David perform with him. He had a room available for free in a building he was renting. Okido and his wife could have it. Julius was a fast talker, and before long had received Okido's approval. David would be getting a new name, and this new name came courtesy of Houdini. The new name would be psycho. This according to Bamberg himself from his book Illusion Show. David had 30 days to work on the new act. The method to this act was difficult and elaborate, and not the easiest thing for a 13-year-old to comprehend, let alone learn. But David had an excellent memory and was soon doing a shortened version of the act successfully. Before long, he was doing the entire act quite well. And then, after a year, strange things started happening where neither he nor Julius Zanzig could explain. In other words, real demonstrations of mind reading would occur even while they were doing an act pretending to be mind readers. It happened enough times that it made both Julius and David nervous and curious. But no good thing lasts forever. The end would happen during a private show for Charles Schwab. Apparently, Schwab had a challenge in store for Zanzig. If David could read a serial number on a $100 bill without seeing it, it would be his. David and Julius began their routine. David began to call out the numbers to Schwab, and to his surprise, true to his word, David got all of them, and Schwab handed the bill over to Julius. When the evening was over, David inquired about his money, specifically the $100 bill challenge, and Julius handed him a single dollar for his part in the show. David was furious. If nothing else, he thought it should be at least 50-50, but Julius was only willing to give up $1. And David went into a rage and left the act. And later, he added, he immediately felt grief for his behavior because, in his own words, Julius had been nothing but kind to him his entire life. Now, after the Zanzig debacle, David was sent off to England to further his education. Now, previously, he had been in school, but very rarely, and he was lucky that he even passed. His education really had only been in magic. Now, arriving in England, one of the first things he did was contact Will Goldston to see if he could purchase some magic on credit. He told Will who he was, the son of Okido, and that he would pay him back after he did his first couple shows. And to his surprise, Goldston sent David enough magic to do a show. But then something surprising happened. He looked at the box that Goldston had sent him, and it had some of the kind of the standard apparatus props of the day, and David realized he had no idea what to do with this stuff. He'd been around magicians his entire life, but he never learned how to do these things. So it took him a month of constant rehearsals just to get them down. The good news is, David Bamberg was a hit with his new equipment. But remember, he'd come to England to get an education. The only problem was that wasn't working out so well. An introduction was arranged for him at Dulwich College. All he had to do was take an exam. He had an hour to complete the assignment. When the hour was over, he had failed royally. He missed every question he answered, and there were others he didn't even bother to answer because he didn't understand them. Now, this led to a series of continual disasters. One, he was trying to recreate the Zanzig act with a new partner who knew nothing about performing. This was a disaster. Then he was offered a job as a film operator at a movie house, and then he got offered a job as an electrician. All of these things were just nightmares. In the evening, though, he had some success. In the evenings, he would spend his time at St. George's Hall, soaking up all he could about the world of magic at that time. He got to see all the latest masculine illusions. He saw the acts of the famous leading magicians in London, P.T. Selbit, Owen Clark, Oswald Williams, Louis Nicola, Jardine Ellis, Alan Shaw, and others. As David himself put it from the book Illusion Show, quote, "I had come to England to complete my education, and that's exactly what I was doing at St. George's Hall. If an aspiring magician wanted to complete his magical education, Where could he find a better place to learn? Unquote. While in London, David made a point of visiting Will Goldston's magic shop, and upon visiting, Golden invited David to the Magician's Club and even persuaded him to do a trick. David agreed, and he knew the perfect trick that would impress all the local magi. He was going to do the needle trick that he had accidentally learned sometime previous while visiting Houdini. The night of the meeting comes, and David's there early. He's a little nervous, but then suddenly, in walks Houdini. Houdini spots David, rushes over and gives him a hug and a handshake, and briefly David feels better, but then the horror of what is happening hits him. He is supposed to do a trick that night. Not any trick. He's supposed to do Houdini's needle trick. This was a disaster in the making. He had to find some way to get out of it, but fate stepped in. You see, while he was sweating, there was a commotion at the door. The great Raymond had arrived, but Houdini stood in the doorway, preventing him from coming in. The two had a huge feud going on. The altercation turned to fists flying in the air. Eventually, Raymond left. And as the group regathered, everyone forgot about David's demonstration. He escaped that one by the skin of his teeth. And now I'd like to fast forward a little bit. It's now around 1925. David has actually joined forces with the aforementioned Great Raymond. Now, I covered Raymond in episode 29 of this podcast, if you want to go check that out. And according to David, Raymond was very ambitious and optimistic type of person. However, David wasn't thrilled with working for Raymond and moved on. In fact, he moved on to work with Li Ho Chang, who would later go by the name Chang. After his time with Chang, David continued to do his show, but he wanted to build it up. He happened upon an ad in a magazine for the Tarbell course in magic, which at that time was a mail order course that actually came with props. And David wrote to Tarbell, and while awaiting an answer, Harlan Tarbell sent him the first 30 lessons for free, along with the props. This allowed him to expand his show. Now he had stuff like the egg bag, the vanishing wand, the linking rings, the paper tearing, the card and banana, the needle trick, he already had that, the multiplying balls, and more. And this material would form the foundation of a new show. In 1929, David, after many years of working both solo and with partners and with other acts, decided to go out on his own. Actually, this decision came with a lot of prodding from his father. He would take on a rather gigantic endeavor, and that was a 2-hour show. He already had the name. Now, he'd been using Psycho for a long time, but now it was time to retire that name and go after a more mystical-sounding name. What could that be? Well, in his youth, he remembered reading the novels of Sax Rohmer, and David Bamberg would take the name from those novels. He would become Fu-Manchu. Now, there was little in common between Sax Rohmer's Fu-Manchu and David Bamberg's Fu-Manchu. The Fu-Manchu from the books was a villain, and David was not going to be a villain, though he acted and dressed as an Asian character, much like the book version. In David's case, he'd be a much friendlier character, and one who would speak Spanish, mostly because these were the countries that David mainly performed in now. He always had been interested in South America and Mexico and other Spanish-speaking countries after learning about Frederick Eugene Powell's adventures in those same countries. This now inspired him. According to David Price's book, the show would have the title, Okido Presents Fu-Manchu, the Devil Doctor. It opened in Buenos Aires and was a huge hit. From there, he took the show to other South American countries and then to Spain, Morocco, and more. In 1937, Fu-Manchu brought his show to America. He had only a few dates scheduled: New York, Hartford, Connecticut, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Baltimore. And there were problems right from the start. Due to Sax Rohmer owning the copyright to the name Fu-Manchu, David had to perform under a different name. In this case, he went by Fu Chan. By all accounts, the show did not make much money, the tour was a failure, and David quickly returned to his Spanish-speaking countries where he could be Fu Manchu and where the audiences loved and adored him. Now, just because the show was not a financial success doesn't mean the show wasn't good. I still recall reading in the pages of Genie in the Vernon Touch column by Di Vernon that the Fu Manchu show was the most beautiful magic show he'd ever seen. David had beautiful hand-painted backdrops and scenery. His props were beautifully painted and decorated, and costumes. There were tons of costumes, and all were exquisite examples of Asian clothing. The magic was great. The production values were great. It was a wonderful show. Later in 1937, Fu Manchu was back in Buenos Aires, and he was in need of a new assistant. He contacted someone he had known to come out and audition, and this person brought along a friend of hers. David only had one position available and chose to only audition the first girl, not her friend. And the friend didn't take kindly to not having the opportunity to audition. Years later, this small, tiny, almost insignificant incident would come back to haunt David. You see, the girl he did not audition, her name was Eva Duarte, but now was known across the globe as Eva Perón, or Evita. She remembered Fu Manchu and the treatment she received, and basically put him through the ringer for a bit. The full story is in the book Illusion Show. I encourage you to check out the entire story. Needless to say, David Bamberg regretted not allowing Eva to audition. It would have saved him a lot of heartache later. As to the early Fu Manchu show, here are some of the illusions in that show. It began with a sort of book of life. Pages were turned, and each page showed a picture of a famous magician until the very last page showed an image of Fu Manchu. And then a burst of smoke, and the picture transformed into the real Fu Manchu. From there, he went into his paper-tearing trick, which was one of his favorites and had plenty of jokes to win over the Spanish-speaking audiences. Fu also did the Noah's Ark illusion, invented by Chevalier Ernest Thorne. He did the sub-trunk with his own unique twist at the end, which included a costume change and coming out of the bag smoking a cigarette. He did the Lady from the Light, or what we often think of today as the shadow box illusion. In David's case, he actually altered the original method to make it more deceptive. Along with the illusions, David also did some of his smaller material, like the linking rings, aerial fishing, pigeon catching, the duck vanish that was made popular by his father, the floating ball, another one of Okito's famous effects. These, mixed with other illusions, incredible costuming, and beautifully painted backdrops, gave the audience so much to enjoy. It was pure spectacle. And David was only getting started. And that, my friends, is where we're going to stop on the early years of David Bamberg. If you thought his early years were filled with crazy adventures, just wait, there is more to come. The second part of his life, after becoming Fu Manchu, is even more incredible. But I'm going to save that for another day. For now, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Magic Detective Podcast. If you did, please be sure to like or heart or whatever your podcast provider will allow you to give a positive feedback to the podcast. If you're on Apple Podcasts and would like to give a 5-star review, that would be fantastic. I'd love that. The next episode is going to be something very special. I will be covering someone who is actually still alive. This person is 94 or 95 years old. This person had a tremendous career in magic. They performed on the Merv Griffin Show, Mike Douglas, many other talk shows, and yet you might not be familiar with this person. This is one you do not want to miss. Until next time, I'm Dean Carnegie. I am the Magic Detective. Please be well and stay safe.